Good afternoon and welcome back to the Expanded Animation Symposium. If you're just tuning in, I want to make you aware of the fact that many of the excellent talks we've had over the past couple of days will be available on our YouTube channel. So if you missed something, you can go back and watch it later. We're going to introduce our next panel, which is entitled Art and Industry. And I have the privilege of introducing our first speaker, Roman Rappak. As a founding member of MiroShot, he is collaboratively exploring the creation of more immersive live performances, including mixed reality, real-time processing, and game design. Roman will be joining us a little bit later for a live question and answer session, so please stay tuned. If you have questions, feel free to post them on our YouTube stream, and enjoy the show.
Hi, my name is Roman Rappak. I'm part of the MiroShot collective. We create immersive content, music, film, software and tools, and we showcase them at events that we put on in art galleries, in cinemas, warehouses and festivals, as well as virtual events in persistent multiplayer worlds. We've got members around the world working across different disciplines and different projects, and it's an open collective. So there'll be details at the end of this talk about how you can join. This talk is called Telling the Future Through Art and Technology, and it's based around this idea expressed really articulately by Marshall McLuhan. He said, "I think that art at its most significant is a DW line, a distant early warning system that can always be relied on to tell the old culture what's beginning to happen to it." It's this idea that art is a window into the future, that by looking at the art being made today, you'd be able to understand what's going to happen tomorrow. This is something I find fascinating, and it actually makes a lot of sense. That artists have to look at the world around them. They have to find patterns and they have to find themes, and then they transmit those patterns and themes to their audience using the tools and technology of their era.
The artist, when he encounters the present, the contemporary artist, is always seeking new patterns, new pattern recognition, which is his task, for heaven's sake. His great need, the absolute indispensability of the artist is that he alone, in the encounter with the present, can give the pattern recognition. He alone has the sensory awareness necessary to tell us what our world is made of. He's more important than the scientist.
New tools and new mediums enable us to say new things and express things in new ways. Artists always rush towards these new tools or these new technologies. The motives of the artist for using the newest technology or working practices are not simply out of the obsession with novelty or consumer electronics. It's not to sell a piece of hardware or increase user adoption. It's to view and describe the world from a new perspective, to say something that hasn't been said before in a way that hasn't been said before. So in many ways, our motives, or the motives of artists to use this technology, are the purest motives. We're using them as a tool of exploration, as a weapon of change. The work being created today in the studios of many of the people watching this talk is a window into tomorrow. It's a window into not only the way that we are going to express ourselves and create work, but a window into the way societies will operate and interact with each other.
The present is only faced in any generation by the artist. The artist is prepared to study the present as his material because it is the area of challenge to the whole sensory life, and therefore it's anti-utopian. It's a world of anti-values, and the artist who comes in contact with the present produces an avant-garde image that is terrifying to the contemporaries.
MiroShot began as an experiment to see what would happen when musicians, coders, visual artists and writers got together to create something that was a hybrid or a blend of all these different disciplines and different ideas that were beginning to emerge So the first step was to create a new kind of live performance, because it was clear that we would need something that we could tour and we could take around the world, that showcased all of the incredible work within the collective. Digital artists, world builders, coders, filmmakers, musicians. And we needed something that would showcase it all in one condensed experience, which was a hybrid between a concert, an immersive piece of theatre, an installation, and a live multiplayer video game. To describe a little bit about how that works, the audience arrive at the show and they experience a concert through a VR headset that switches between reality via an onboard camera and completely virtual landscapes. The most important thing is they're all experiencing this together. At the same time as being in reality at a real event, they are distanced from reality and they are all simultaneously experiencing a virtual landscape, a virtual world, a world that only exists on the hard drive of the device that they're viewing it through. On a wider level, Mirrorshot was built to explore these new ways of communicating through art. A new kind of band, a new kind of collective, one that reflected the changes in the world around us. So it's an open collective, meaning anyone can join, and it was born out of this need to understand the new ways we're creating content and new ways that we're sharing it, to explore how the old ways of creating art and sharing art are collapsing, whether it's the old record label system or the cinema studio system, that just as these things fall away and just as these things get disrupted, new structures and new artists fill that space with the things that they're making. The first thing we built was our own multi-user VR app, which meant we could create shows that would leverage all the incredible things that were happening in the VR space and in technology, and center it around the two most powerful tools that exist, in my opinion, the most powerful creative tools, which is live performance and music. That you can communicate an idea in a 3-minute piece of music and possibly a music video. You can communicate an idea quicker and express it more clearly than in any other format, especially with YouTube and SoundCloud and Spotify, that you can get an idea out there quicker and more efficiently using those tools than you can with any other. After we played our first shows at the Institute of Contemporary Art, we got an art grant from the Dutch government. We played at BAFTA Cinema, we played at Wired events, festivals in Hamburg and Paris, and off the back of that we signed with Believe for records and Warp Publishing and Paradigm as our booking agent. And we began to realise that we could use the music industry structure to try and share and explore what we're doing using those existing tools. A lot of people told us that this would be a kind of professional suicide, that in the music industry you're not supposed to get game designers on board and app developers on board, and in the tech industry you're not supposed to release records or play in smoke-filled rooms in Amsterdam. It was a unique situation, and it was also an exciting place to be because no one could really tell us we were doing it wrong, but also we had no idea if we were doing the right thing. The old system and the old tools for using art and technology, the argument is that those aren't the album, the film, the music video, aren't adequate for expressing something new or relevant about the world around us, and that there are things that are being said in video games or things that are being said with startups and apps that go way beyond what you can express with just a film or a music video. And for us that was an invitation to say, well, we want to use these tools and use those structures to get our ideas across. One question we get asked a lot is it a band or is it a startup? Because we didn't ever originally start this as just a group to release records. But we also didn't start it as a tech company. We were approached by labels and approached by management companies, and equally we were approached as a startup by investors who were excited by the fact that we could create these experiences. And initially we were reticent to kind of commit to any of those people or structures or companies, because it felt like it would limit what we're trying to do. But in the last year or so we've realised that there's a lot in the music industry that helps us get our ideas across. And there's a lot in the tech startup world which gives us incredible opportunities to play shows in places we've never been, to share our ideas with people, to get new tools, to reach out to new artists. Using this music industry mechanisms of touring and release schedules and music videos, and boosted it by augmented technology in the tech industry and the excitement around spatial computing and immersive tech. We've done shows at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Amsterdam, we've done events at the Barbican in London, Nuit Blanche, I Love Trans Music Festival, VR Ham Festival in Hamburg. We've been able to explore all these different ways of communicating. We have gamers that come to our shows, we have art fans, we have electronic music nerds, we have all these different types of people from all these different walks of life who are all curious and all excited to see what's going to happen next.
You entered into this dreamscape landscape that was somewhere like halfway between a desert, halfway between another planet.
Dat ik niet eens kon zien van wat is eigenlijk realiteit en wat is de fictie.
I had to look down, and it was like you were going to heaven.
And you just forget your body, actually. You're completely focusing on your ears and on your eyes. So everything just vanish. And you're just searching because you know there is a band playing.
Like, it's so vivid and it's so colorful, and at the same time you don't really know where you are. It's just a place where you're sort of captivated by all the visuals and the sounds around you, and I really couldn't get enough of it. It was triggering my interest so much that I wanted to stay there and go further and explore more.
Where are the boundaries between those two worlds?
It was like entering into a sort of a dream state, I would say, and I was thinking halfway like, wow, I've never done an LSD trip or something, but surely it must be something like this.
It's a great journey, of course, through space and time, but it's also the good thing about it is that it's not only.
How did you feel when you came out of it?
Yeah, crazy. It was like I had goosebumps at the inside of my skin. So it was. Then I felt my body again. So it was that you're something. We're totally. Yeah, I don't know where I was, but not here anymore. And then I came back. So it was, I think it was amazing, yeah.
But it's more like if you're going to experience something sacred, or like going into a cathedral or something.
This is really thrilling to experience this.
The feeling of being in space because of the stars and then going to places you didn't know existed.
When the music really came on strong, it had this flip right in time to this big tree and this blackness with all these colored leaves.
Ik zag een vrouw met rode ogen. Een soort van alienvrouw.
I wasn't sure if it was male or female or android or animal.
When you actually had a feeling that you're flying through space, because then you're cutting loose of everything what is around you.
Tools and the ways of working change the art that's being made. So by using a different tool, you're changing what the message is. Is this idea that the art form that you choose and the medium that you choose changes the message that you're putting across. You could argue that in the same way that the Manifesto of 60s counterculture was written with electric guitars and the album format and television, this current era is being described and being defined by artists like you guys and by tools that are in the earlier stages, from real-time video technology to machine learning, virtual reality, augmented reality. Also concepts such as open source collaboration and creation, world building, game design, user experience design. And so it's given rise to a new era, and in a lot of ways it's given rise to a new art movement. The history of the world has always been described and defined by the history of art. And the history of art has always been dictated by the history of technology. Even the shift in the way that we consume film, or what a film is, because of things like DVD box sets and Netflix. The history of music as well is a timeline of technological innovation, from the Beatles using the Mellotron to Joy Division using synths, or MPCs creating hip-hop and sampling culture. And the explosion of the early days of the internet, of MySpace and SoundCloud, and the way that we would consume music in a completely different way, and therefore that the artists would create their art in a different way. This talk is a look at what this new future might be, how it's taking shape, and the artists that are at the forefront of it, and the tools that are changing everything, and the innovations in technology that have already begun to shape our art and therefore are shaping our future. So everything from volumetric capture to 5G, VR, deepfakes, real-time rendering, all of these things are at a point where we're just starting to explore them, and we're approaching a point of convergence where all of these mediums and all of these different modes of expression will be able to fuse to create a new meaning or a new truth in the way that we're looking at the world and in what it means to be alive. So the show we created draws on all these things. It looks at classical disciplines such as live music, art and theatre, but also fuses it with these revolutionary breakthroughs happening in immersive technology like projection mapping, volumetric capture, generative art, artificial intelligence, etc. The idea is to make this new hybrid form of art, which is inspired by Gesamtkunstwerk, which means total art. New art movements have to be this amalgamation of all these different disciplines and all these different artists, and only then can we achieve a new perspective on life, because we've drawn on all these different talented artists who all have their own things to say and all have their own tools with which to say it. But all of this leads to this idea about, that's the title of this talk, which is about the future of technology and how we can predict the future based on the way that artists are using technology. We're in a period where there is a new way of expressing the inexpressible, and there is a new way of communicating and new tools with which to communicate it. And the thing about art movements, whether it's situationists, fluxists, cubists, any movement of thought or art is often only understood after it's happened. And so the argument with that we're putting forward as a band and as a collective and as a studio is to say that we're currently living through it, and the work that we're making and the work that many of you who are watching this are making is more than just the work itself. It's a statement about these shifts that are happening in art. Even the way that this talk is being communicated to you, or the DSLR that's filming this, or the laptop you're watching it on, or the work that you'll do after watching this, all of these are so deeply rooted in technology and technological revolutions that they are themselves a statement about the changes that are happening.
In 1844, the first year of the commercial telegraph, Kierkegaard published a book called The Concept of Dread. He was quite aware that a new environment had formed around the old mechanical one, and whenever a new environment goes around an old one, there's always new terror. We live in a time when we have put a man-made satellite environment around the planet. The planet is no longer nature, it's no longer the external world, it's now the content of an artwork. The planet, nature has ceased to exist.
Well, I think you're anticipating a century, perhaps, but...
Saying that we're in the middle of an art movement is obviously a pretty massive statement, but it's one I want to try and back up. So art movements are pretty abstract things. They're often incredibly difficult to define or follow, especially while we're living through them or while they're happening. But their effect is always profound. It doesn't only reflect the state of the world, it defines the path that the world is taking. And so certain things from my perspective show us that at this point in history we are experiencing one on a massive scale. So movements often happen in times of shifts in technological or social upheaval, So everything from the Florentine masters to the Impressionists to 60s counterculture or punk culture or rave culture, a political, technological upheaval, whether that's the development of radio or the internet, printing press, Reformation, Enlightenment. For the benefit of this talk, I'm just going to refer to it as new art, because we don't have a name for what this era is or what this ism is going to be known as. How do we define this new era, or how can we tell that we're going through one? I guess the easiest way of doing this is we define what new art is, right? So new art is collaborative. If you look at the breakthroughs that are happening in real-time video production or video games themselves, you have to have someone who understands architecture, someone who understands acting, someone who understands physics, someone who understands coding, servers, networking, aesthetics, lenses. You need to have such a wide range of different disciplines that you return to this idea of total art, that the expression of all these people added up together is subsequently more honest and tells us more about humanity than any of those individual people creating their work on their own. The new art is immersive. Art can now envelop an audience, so we're no longer looking at it through a painting or a photograph or a 2D window into these worlds. The audiences can be inside the worlds that we're now making.
Professor McLuhan, is television the ultimate medium, or is there worse to come?
You've heard of the hologram? The hologram goes completely around you. Television only goes a little bit around you. The hologram is 360 degrees. But it's been anticipated by the rock music, in which you have to become just enclosed in a sound bubble. The hologram does for TV what rock does for auditory entertainment. But the hologram is technically here.
If you can watch every single Hitchcock film just by hitting spacebar, or listen to every single track that the Wu-Tang Clan ever released with 3 clicks, then logically audiences crave experiences that are more intense, that are more immersive, that envelop them, a world that they can actually visit. You're looking for something that surrounds you, something that has an intensity. We're more comfortable with jumping into different worlds. And what I mean by that is we're more comfortable with the idea of abstraction, with the idea of this reality breaking down. Perhaps we don't even feel like the real world is as real as it was, so we're more comfortable with jumping into another universe. It's less abstract, it's less of a leap of imagination, because we arrived here in an Uber that was an icon that we looked at on our phone. We paid for it with a bank account that's completely invisible. We tagged our friends that we saw. We put an image of ourselves on Instagram. Very few of these actions have anything to do with reality, and so we spend a lot of our time in this hyper reality, and therefore of course we're going to want to jump into a video game, or of course we're going to want to be in an immersive world or a VR experience, because it's less of a detachment from reality. New art is generative. So this is something that new technology can do, which would have been impossible a decade or so ago, which is to write itself. The reasons behind our fascination with this go far beyond just being obsessed with something that's new. In fact, without getting too philosophical about it, one argument is that these machines, or AI itself, and these things that we've built are a reflection of us. So they are, in the same way that an adult will be fascinated by their child, we're fascinated by this reflection of our personality, a kind of a narcissistic obsession with this AI child that we've built. What will it create? What art will it make? Because it's a reflection of us because we created it, but there's this sort of fascination and terror with what it will do because it's off on its own in our image, creating things. New art is interactive, so the way that we engage and consume art has become a lot less passive. We'll always want to be told stories, we'll always want to sit back and watch a film, but suddenly we have agency. Suddenly there's a medium where we're in the film, or we're alongside the artist. The role of the creator has become less about forcing someone to look at one way or the other, and it's more about building a world and gently guiding them, taking a step back while your player or your audience experience the thing we've created at their own pace or in their own way. Our audience can suddenly do more than explore our work. They can tear it apart, they can reconstitute it and remix it. So new art is open source. In the same way that the actual interaction with the work has become an engaged and interactive experience, the creation of the art itself has become a participatory event. So the work is separated from simply creators and audience. The audience have an active role in its creation.
You're arguing about something more profound.
Oh yeah, I'm talking about the actual context and the state of content is going to be so different to anything that we can really envisage at the moment, where the interplay between the user and the provider will be so in simpatico. It's going to crush our ideas of what mediums are all about. But it's happening in every form. It's happening in visual art. The breakthroughs at the early part of the century with people like Duchamp, who were so prescient in what they were doing and putting down. The idea that the piece of work is not finished until the audience come to it and add their own interpretation, and what the piece of art is about is the grey space in the middle. That grey space in the middle is what the 21st century is going to be about.
A good example of this was the recent Sonic film that was made, where images were released of how the film would look, and there was an uproar in the gaming community and film community. Everyone hated how it looked, and the director went back to the drawing board and they built it all from scratch because of the feedback from the audience. Before a film was even made, the audience was participating in its creation. I think that's just the start of it. If you look at things like Roblox or Minecraft or Fortnite, this idea that the consumer of the art is building the art itself is only going to become more and more pronounced. The last thing I'm going to leave you guys on is this idea of our role. How can we tell the future through art and technology, and what does it mean? We're writing this new manifesto with the work we're making, and the technology that we're using is doing more than describing the world around us. We're defining the world around us, and the images and games and films and worlds that you guys are building and that Mirrorshot as a collective is building, it's the way that we are expressing the world around us. Thanks so much for watching this talk. Get in touch with us via our website, www.mirrorshot.com, or on Instagram or Facebook or anything. We have some events lined up that we're announcing soon, and we'd love to feature your work. We also have a variety of resources available to help artists along their way. Thanks so much for having us.
With a live session with Roman. Thank you for taking some time and joining us, and thanks for the excellent talk. We've been talking actually for the past 20 minutes about different things, very inspiring. And I'd actually like to start with one of those first questions that we started with, and that is this idea that artists have the task of pattern recognition. Right. And I read a New York Times article years ago about trying to use the media as a way to predict the future. And one of the statements in that article was that the crystal ball is always cracked. Yeah? And I wanted to know, how does that affect the artist's job of pattern recognition and trying to provide a view of the future?
Well, I think it if anything, it helps the idea of the artist being someone who's tasked with pursuing this. Because when you say the crystal ball's cracked, it's because with radio or with TV or with the internet or whatever it is, the people who are trying to predict what the future of that will be are often investors, people who are trying to sell hardware, stock markets, and people who are like the dot-com bubble is a good example. You have an entire industry knows that someone's going to be the Amazon and the Google and the Facebook, but no one knows if it's going to be Friendster, or no one knows if it's going to be MySpace. No one knows any of those things. So I think that the strength of artists, or the kind of unique attribute that an artist has, is that it doesn't really matter whose stocks are going to go up, or whether we're all going to be buying VHS or Betamax. What's important is what you're saying with those formats. And a lot of times, whoever uses that tool in the best way, that tool becomes the crystal ball. That tool becomes the thing that we can kind of tell the future with.
Okay. You have been focusing a lot on making more immersive live performances. And one of the things that I think is essential for that is having the audience more integrated into the performance. And that means more than just being interactive, it means having some form of feedback channel. How does Miro Shot approach that?
Well, in the apps we've developed, for instance, the one that we showed a lot in there, it comes into two categories, to be specific. There's the at-home version that people can access online on their phones, on consoles or whatever. And then there's the location-based experience, which is something we've done in Amsterdam and in Paris that we showed you videos of. And the thing that we've been exploring is this idea that as the audience is central to it, which is, in that quote from David Bowie where he describes how the role between the artist and the creator and the consumer of the art kind of becomes so vague that they're almost part of the same narrative. What we've been developing is this idea that we can change what the performance is doing and what the experience is doing based on where the audience are in their VR experiences. They're on a multiplayer network, so they can control, they can look towards different things, they can fly towards different areas. And we can, for the first time as musicians and as artists, say, okay, well, everyone's moved towards this area or that area, so we can modulate and change what we're doing based on. I mean, in a way, it's nothing new. Like a really great live act reads the crowd, or a great comedian shifts the entire structure of their narrative based on what got laughs or what part of the room got laughs. And I think that I think you've hit on something really important, that with all this technology, it's so overwhelming, it's so powerful and so incredible that it's often easy to forget what's great about a concert anyway. It's easy to forget what's great about just standing next to your friend when they play the song that you guys both love. And that you as artists, we're kind of like so overwhelmed by these tools and the kind of godlike powers they give us that we just want to use everything. And I think that it's a question of augmenting what's great about a show or what's great about reality in general, or the emotional response you have to a concert, rather than just come into the mental, like, bit crunched future world that is going to blow your mind.
What I really liked about the pre-recorded talk, it sort of reminded me of a form of, and the same with the music videos, a form of digital storytelling, employing lots of different technologies and forms of media together. And in essence, the work is more than just the installation, but it's also the video about the installation where you interview people after they've been to the show and such. So that's just as much part of the content as the show itself.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to, like, the band's named after a surrealist, and the whole, you can obviously, surrealism, you can go down that rabbit hole and research it your entire life and still not even scratch the surface. But from my perspective, the thing that I take from it is that it's the analysis of the work and the imagination of the people that are watching it and the kind of conclusions that they draw. That's the magic. That's where the art happens. It's not actually what paintbrush you use. It's not actually whether you use this lens or you cut away to this, or it's about knowing that my audience will experience this and they will be drawn to this conclusion and then they'll decide this, which is like when you get it right, it's almost a supernatural kind of, it's almost like telekinesis when you get it right, when you're empathizing with your audience and you're appreciating what route they'll take through the work. You also realize you are kind of, you've created this world, but you don't have ownership over it. And I think that's why we keep going back to this idea of game design and video game design as an art form that is, in a way, it's almost like the most contemporary art form you can have, because it's something that you're creating this world for your audience, and then you're taking a step back and you're letting them walk around it, draw their own conclusions. So yeah, I think there's a lot we can take from that.
In the context of live performance, would you say that scalability is a bit of an issue? I mean, partially due to the technology, but also, you mentioned, reading the crowd like a comedian might do. They're focusing on certain elements. They're not trying to read it all at once and, get the delta or the mean or something like that.
Yeah.
How does scalability play a role?
I think if you'd have asked me that before COVID, I would have said, well, as we're a band, we're signed, we have a record to promote, we need to get out there and we need to play to the people. And that's the point of what we do. When we're writing this music, when we're talking about this stuff, we're always envisaging being in the room with people. And a lot of people pre-COVID were like, yeah, but virtual concerts, come on, like who will ever be interested in going to a virtual concert? You'd much rather go to a real concert. And so the conversation takes a completely different tone now, because we're doing these, they are distance safe concerts, right? People have got, we can sell out a venue, of a 300 cap venue with only 10 people sitting there. They are distance, it's all safe, everything's kind of cleaned, and you have people coming in for their 15 minutes of this experience and they leave. So we can actually sell as many tickets as we would have done before. And that means as many people, we reach as many people as we would have done if it had been a regular show. Adding to that is the other part of our of what our group is putting together, which is a virtual version of this. So that scalability question is kind of, the numbers kind of go through the roof. If you look at the recent Fortnite Travis Scott concert, I think the statistics, I mean, are pretty mental. Like 17 times more people attended the Travis Scott concert than attended Woodstock. So it was the largest gathering in human history of one format or another of people experiencing a music concert. Now, that obviously the music industry, and that's something that's just had a $28 billion hit. You are really keen to find out how the hell someone can do a concert now in this current climate of, you know, COVID, distancing, everything's shut down, all concerts are cancelled, all events are cancelled. So as a band, we're in this really interesting position where a lot of the things that we were doing were to explore artistically how we could push this format. And then all of a sudden, because of a pandemic, it stops being a theoretical question and it starts being a question of necessity. Like, there are millions of incredible artists out there who've got amazing records that if there was not a pandemic, they would be out there touring, they would be doing radio shows, they'd be reaching their audience, and the whole thing's come to a standstill. So I think we find ourselves in a position where, just as we're doing this talk remotely, if the pandemic had hit 10 years ago, the entire Ars Electronica Festival would just have to have been cancelled. But these things can still exist in different ways because of the fact that we've got this technology. So I think that's what we're exploring.
Mm-hmm. One of the other goals of MirrorShot, in addition to sort of exploring immersive media, is to get more people involved. And so if I'm a media artist and I'm sort of interested in gaining some experience, or how can I use MirrorShot? What's available?
Yeah, well, it has been something that's been really important. And again, it's not just about building an enormous global art army, although that is part of it, but it's about saying, like, the era of where artists or bands or even labels were this elite group of people and no one was allowed in, that stuff kind of it's a dated way of existing. If you look at the way video games or modding community works, you know, the thing is created by, and I touched on this a little bit in the talk, is created by the community, by the people who are experiencing. And they are, you know, good. The modding community and the way that they've developed, like the whole of sort of, you know about Gary's mod and all this kind of stuff, an entire chunk of popular culture is dictated by the consumers and the artists that are doing it, and the groups that create this become an open source community. So we're keen to reflect that, because there hasn't really ever been this a band really that's used this kind of open source, crowdsourced method, because I think that then it goes back to what I was saying about an honest message is created by a large group of people, rather than just the thoughts of 4 elitist people who sit there creating their own work. This is meant to be, when we look back on this in 5 or 6 years, will be a more accurate reflection of where the world was and where people were and the things that excited them and the things that scared them, than if it had just been 4 people who needed to deliver a record to their label.
You mentioned COVID and changes of direction and such. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the upcoming activities from MirrorShot?
Yeah, sure. We've been developing this new live show, which is if you go to www.mirrorshot.com and download the MirrorShot World app, you can get it for Mac or PC. This is a city that we've built, and you can jump into that, and we'll have a live show if you go to our Instagram or Facebook when we announce the times and dates. And all of the community meets within this world. It's not a streamed concert. It's part role-playing RPG, part live concert, part interview. You can interact with the people who are there. You can speak to the band. We can decide what the set is going to be or what questions get asked. It's meant to be a look at the way that we can interact with the people creating the project, showcase the art that's being made within the collective, and generally keep building the community.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you. We're still got a little bit of time left if there's any questions from the live chat, but I'd like to use this opportunity in any case to thank you again for your time, for the excellent video. As I mentioned before, this will be available on the YouTube channel later on as well. So if anyone would be interested in the video, please feel free to link it, to share it. And I'm certain that we'll have a lot of views in the next few days. Thanks again for participating in the symposium. Best of luck for your work. We'll definitely be looking out for future performances in EuroShop.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Our next speaker is already waiting in our live chat. It's Kate Edwards. Kate Edwards has worked on a number of very well-known AAA game titles as a cartographer and a geographer. And today she will be giving us a talk about creating a more inclusive game industry.
Greetings, everyone. Hi, I'm Kate Edwards. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Game Jam organization. I'm also a geographer who's been doing culturalization work in the game industry for over 27 years now. And I used to run the International Game Developers Association. And so between all of those functions that I've served, the topic of inclusion and diversity and equity and all of these things that impact us in our creative process, both on the creator side and on the consumer side, are things I've had to deal with directly for many, many years now. And so in the brief time that I have here, I wanted to talk about forging an inclusive game industry. And naturally, a lot of the things I'm going to be saying apply to many different industries. We're very much aware of the Me Too movement and what's been going on there, that started in Hollywood and has moved over into other industries as well, including games. But this is primarily focused on games, but I think there's going to be takeaways that will really apply to pretty much any workplace. So, one of the things that's been disturbing, of course, is when we see these stories in the media about different companies that basically have tripped up. And the other thing that we're very much aware of course, is the toxic communities that are out there. This is no secret to any of us who use the internet. And in the gaming communities, it tends to be particularly bad. And so there's a certain responsibility that is placed on the companies that are providing these communities around their games. And yet, when at the same time, when we're seeing the toxicity in the player side community, and you wonder, why is the company not addressing this? Well, a lot of times it's because the company itself has a culture that is somewhat toxic and sexist and has problems of its own. And this is no secret either. We see these stories on a fairly regular basis, unfortunately, in the game industry. And I'm hopeful that the more we see these stories is basically revealing the fact that there's more light being shown on this issue. So more people are willing to stand up and to say something about a toxic work environment and about the problems that are there. But what we really want to address, though, is how do we strive to make sure we don't have that kind of environment in the first place? And that's really what I want to focus on in the short time that I have. So, again, I've been around quite a while in the game industry. I've talked a lot at a lot of events. I've visited a lot of developers all over the world, emerging markets, all kinds of different markets. And one of the things that it's very common to me that I hear are the complaints about these various issues. And so that's one of the reasons why, even before, this was several years back, why I made that decision to take on a more advocacy side of my career and to focus on how do we actually make things better? What can we actually do to improve the situation? So I took over the International Game Developers Association back in 2012, and and it was challenging. So we were focusing on a lot of issues that were affecting the game industry, a lot of things that are very systemic and are not going to go away anytime soon. But it's important that we take these challenges on. At the same time, however, I was running the IGDA during the campaign known as Gamergate, which was a misogynistic campaign online, and I was one of their primary targets. And so when it comes to toxicity, when it comes to feeling the lack of diversity, I know exactly what this feels like because I have been there. And so, yeah, this was not a very nice time to be in the game industry, and it's certainly not a nice time to be running a global organization and being very visible as a woman in a leadership role, because I was a target. And so fortunately, though, we got past this, at least for the most part, and we're able to move on. What was really important about this episode in the game industry, though, is similar to how the Me Too movement woke up Hollywood a few years later. This incident in the game industry was the start of a process of waking up the game industry, a process which I believe is still taking place. It wasn't one punctuated moment. You might wonder, though, but why then would I stick around in the game industry? And a lot of women, a lot of underrepresented people left the game industry during that period because they just felt that there was just that level of toxicity, and the companies not addressing it directly was a huge problem. But one of the reasons I still love games, as many of us do who work in this industry, is because this, for example, is a chart of all these different forms of communication that have existed since the beginning of humanity. And I see video games as the current evolution of human narrative. And because we are taking this unique combination of art and technology and combining those in an interactive way to develop a system for how we pass stories and narratives and experiences from one generation to another. And to me, that's really exciting. It's a really cool part of being part of the game industry, and it's not something I want to just walk away from. The other part too, which I think a lot of people are aware, and is that games are currently the largest entertainment source on the planet in terms of revenue. And so you can see here games compared to other forms of creative media out there. And yes, these numbers are 3 years old, but the proportions still remain the same. And what's amazing is that video games, even if you take all of live sports around the world, like FIFA and American football and baseball and all that stuff, the game industry still makes more money than even live sports. So it is a going concern. This is a large industry that has a huge amount of influence on people, both on the consumers and on the creative side. So when we talk about diversity, you might have heard the term DEI that a lot of people use recently. It used to be we just said the word diversity, and then diversity evolved into the word inclusion instead of diversity. But now you might hear a lot of people say DEI. So what exactly is DEI? Well, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion. So let me just explain those very briefly, because that's important for this conversation. So diversity is basically what makes us different. It's generally our characteristics, our culture, our geography of origin, our skin color, our religion, all those kinds of factors. Those are basically diversity. So it's just the things that make us different. Equity is the sense of promoting justice among people who are different. So impartiality and fairness. So do we have those processes in place? Do the processes that we create reflect a sense of equity, or are they biased towards a certain group or another? And then inclusion is essentially the degree to which all these diverse individuals have a role to play in the process, in the program. Do they have a voice in the company? And are they listened to? Do they have the same, basically an equitable voice within that process and within that industry? And that's really why all three of these together are important considerations. One without the other really doesn't work, because really, if you have a successful program in any company, you have to be thinking about all three of these, about DEI, not just one of these. So back when I ran the International Game Developers Association, we created a survey called the Developer Satisfaction Survey that we did every year, and I believe it's still done. And so what was interesting, we asked a lot of questions to game developers to kind of get a sense of who they are and what they're interested in. And so one of the things we asked them, though, was how long do you plan to remain in the game industry? And it wasn't surprising that the biggest answer was indefinitely. And this is an answer that you'll see repeated across a lot of other creative media media, whether it's animation or film or music or anything else. What this answer is saying is that if you're a creative person, it's in your soul. It's something that you want to do for the rest of your life, and you're not just going to walk away from it. It's not like, being an accountant or something and saying, well, I'm going to retire in a certain amount of time. Most people in a creative industry don't retire. They just do it until they expire. Another interesting thing is that when we ask them what statement best describes your relationship with your current employment, a lot of people would say that this is my career and a large part of my life. So the picture that's being painted here is that being a game developer is so integral to who they are as a person. So it's really, again, it's kind of in their souls, so to speak. It's something that really drives them and something what they're very interested in. However, the other side of that coin is when we ask a question like this, what factors do you feel influence the public's negative perception of the game industry? You can see here how the sexism and racism issues are very high in the developers. This is, asking game developers these questions. And what's unfortunate is that even if you compare the couple of years of data that I have here between 2015 and 2016, the perception actually got worse. They actually felt the sexism increased and the racism increased year over year between the two dates of the survey. That's not the trend we want to see. We want to see it go the other way. We want to have people feeling like we're actually addressing these issues. But again, given some of the stories that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, obviously there is a problem here. So, what's interesting, though, is when we ask developers, how do you rate the following? So when we ask them if they felt diversity in the workplace is important, and not just in the game industry, but just any workplace, is diversity important? And this was really encouraging. You can see the huge jump between 2015 and 2016. A huge amount of people agree with this, that diversity is important. The other part is diversity in the game industry. You could see, again, there was a huge jump about people feeling that diversity in the game industry is very important. So that's super encouraging. Even though we're having problems both on the consumer and the industry side, it's encouraging to see that most, the great majority of game developers feel that it's important. So, and diversity in game content as well. Should our games be reflecting people of different different backgrounds and representations? And they believe that's very important too. So that's great. That's encouraging data to see. But how does that really play out? One of the things we think about when we think about the word diversity, again, like I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, there's a lot of different ways to think about it. And a couple that I want to mention on here, and the reason I'm showing you this slide is because a lot of times people forget age. So like ageism is a huge problem in the game industry. It's a huge problem in the technology sector, tends to be a problem in general, of course, in different workplaces. But ageism is especially pronounced in the game industry, which is a serious problem. Also things like mental health and neurodiversity. There are a lot of people out there who actually deal with mental health issues on a very regular basis, on a chronic basis. In fact, the great majority of us do. And so this is something that's often overlooked in terms of being something that's diverse, but that is a dimension of diversity as well. And so we have to keep that in mind. Now, the gender diversity as it breaks down in the game industry, this data is a little bit dated at this point, but the proportions are somewhat similar. So you can see here that, the representation of women and transgender people and people of other orientation is pretty low in the game industry. And that 20% figure for women has generally proven true on average over the last several years, and it tends to be somewhat true across different locales. This data, by the way, this survey was done across the world, although about 48% of the respondents were based in the US. So it's a little bit weighted towards the US, but there is, representation from all over the world. And ethnic diversity as well is skewed, of course. Naturally, this is going to vary depending on your location, but in general, this is what the numbers came back in the survey. So again, not a lot of representation going on from the ethnic diversity standpoint. What's interesting too, though, is when we ask the developers the question, do you feel there's equal treatment and opportunity for everyone in the game industry? And again, this is between the 2 years of data here. You can see that the people who answered yes, it actually decreased significantly by 13% and increased quite a bit as well. So increased, I mean the no answers. So this is, again, not a good trend. This is not the way we want to see it. So what am I saying here? Essentially, based on the survey data, a lot of game developers believe that diversity is really important. They believe that representation is important. So they stand by it, but they also realize that there is not equal opportunity for everyone in the game industry. They don't see it that way. And they also just, they basically see the dark side of the reality of what's going on. So including things like the gender wage cap. So when you think about that previous question, is there equal opportunity? This is a perfect example of how there is not equal opportunity. When you see this data, and unfortunately there has not been a really comprehensive salary survey since this one, but this data kind of speaks for itself in terms of what the inequity going on here really is. Now, I've heard some great anecdotes every once in a while from different companies who actually took an effort to address their wage gap. That was raised as an issue by one of their employees. The leadership and management of the company took it seriously, and they investigated. They had HR look into it, and sure enough, they came back and said, yes, we have people working in similar roles with similar levels of experience, and yet they have different salaries because of their gender. And so that was a great step for them to do. The most important step, however, was not just knowing that, they actually changed it. They made the decision and said, well, let's fix this. And that came from the CEO of the company. So they just said, let's just make sure this doesn't happen again. And so they fix it. That's rare, obviously. That doesn't happen in a lot of companies today, unfortunately. What's interesting too is the disparity we see between the industry side and the consumer side. And this data plays out across different countries. I'm just using the United States as an example. So with the data that came in most recently from 2020 and 2019, you can see that 41% of game players in the US are women. That's dropped a little bit, just a few percentage points in the last year or two. But then 24% of game developers are women. So there's a huge disparity there. You kind of wonder, so why is the industry side not having that same level of engagement? And there's a lot of reasons for this that I don't even have time to go into all the reasons for it. But there's a lot of systemic societal reasons, education reasons, cultural reasons why we don't see more women on the game industry side actually making games and being part of the creative process. And of course, again, this plays out into a lot of other creative industry. It's not unique to games. And again, this is not unique to the United States. But we see this gap here, and this gap is pretty stark. So what we're trying to do, what we're striving to do, what we should be aiming to do is that we want to see that those who create games better reflect those who play them. Because we know for a fact that games are played everywhere. They are a ubiquitous form of entertainment now, much the same way that people have a choice. They can watch film, they can, read a book, they can, look at art, they can do all kinds of things, listen to music, and games have now squarely and clearly have fit into human society as another form of entertainment. So, but we want to see more representation in that particular creative media. So what we need to do is maximize the global reach of our games and consider the expectations of a much broader demographic. So it's not just about thinking about men and women, the gender diversity issue, or people of color versus white, or whatever, however you want to divide up what diversity, inclusion, and equity mean. It's a much bigger picture than that. It's also about the broadest sense of who plays our games and who is our community. And again, I kind of already answered that question. The answer is that it's everybody from all walks of life, from all socioeconomic backgrounds, from all ethnic and religious backgrounds, political backgrounds, whatever it might be. There's a commonality that it is an activity that all people do at some point. So, and this stretches back to the beginning of human history. Gameplay is not new, obviously. Some of the earliest artifacts we've seen from different cultures, like in Pakistan, with the Urdu culture, and with ancient Egypt, they created games. They made board games. They made all kinds of games. So this stretches way back in our history. Again, video games are just kind of the latest upgrade of that particular media. So. one of the things that's interesting is some of the studies that have been done recently about, for example, this one called Tech Leavers. Why do people leave the industry? And this one was specifically focused more on women. So why are women leaving the tech sector? And I thought this was really interesting because what they said from their study, which was quite comprehensive, and I encourage you to look it up. They said unfairness is what's driving turnover more than anything else. So if there's perceived unfairness in the workplace for whatever reason, whether it's a gender wage gap or something else, there will be much higher turnover. Also, the experiences differ dramatically across different demographics. So like the perception of men and the situation is far different from the perception that women have of the workplace. And I think that's kind of a given. The unfairness also costs billions each year because it's driving people away, and there's career changes, and companies have to spend a lot of money onboarding people. So if you're not keeping your retention high, retention is often one of those forgotten things that, we spend so much effort trying to recruit people of diverse backgrounds and, striving to show them that we're an inclusive company, and yet so little work tends to be done on retaining those people once they're actually in the company. So that speaks more to the company culture aspect that needs to be improved. And also, we also found in this study that diversity inclusion initiatives actually do help, but they have to be done right, and they have to be focused in a way that is somewhat tailored to the company's specific situation. So one of the things, this chart that came up was this question, one of the questions was, which of the following describes the reason you left your previous employer? And you could see unfairness and mistreatment, 37%. So that's significant. More than a third of the people cited unfairness as the main reason. You can see a breakdown of some of that: not satisfied with the work environment, seeking better opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. So again, this plays out across a lot of different tech companies, which includes games as well. And so it's obviously something that needs to be addressed. What I find interesting is that there are great examples out there of how this has been addressed. And so here's one example. Now, this is not from the game industry, unfortunately. This is actually from the television side. So in the US, there's a network called FX Networks. And the CEO, John Landgraf, at one point, he made a decision back during this season that basically he looked across the people who were creating the content, creating the shows for his network, and decided, that there was a situation that was a problem. And what he saw was that in the 2014 to 2015 season, 12% of directors of his programs were women or people of color. So only 12%. But then, within 2 years, in the 2016-2017 season, 51% of directors were women or people of color. So you might ask, how the hell did that change so quickly? And it's quite simple, actually. So here's a quote from John, which I'm actually going to read. "We just happened to be all be working in a system that was biased. We weren't taking responsibility for stepping up and acknowledging that and saying, we will be the change." So what am I saying here? You might guess already. Basically, how do we change this and become a more inclusive industry? It's a matter of will. All it takes, just like the gender wage gap issue I mentioned earlier, it takes the leadership of the company to recognize the problem and to actually decide to change it. And oftentimes that's all it takes. It's just a matter of will. And so how do we get them? We have to get them to that point where they realize that it's a problem. And oftentimes that is really the problem, is not, that challenge of getting leadership to understand what the real issues are, among the people who work for them. And so again, with FX Networks, what's interesting is when they made that shift, and they included far more people of diverse backgrounds as their creative leaders on their network, their Emmy nominations, which is the television award for the US, their Emmy nominations in 2015, they were down, at 38 total. And the next year they were at 56. Now, does being more inclusive and having more diverse people create their content, is that an impact? I don't know for sure. I don't know if there's a direct correlation there, but it's an interesting comparison to see that shift in creative talent and becoming more diverse and inclusive in the creative side actually led to more accolades on the public side. Is there a relationship? Could be. There might be. Now, several years back when I was running the IGDA, we did a conference, a leadership conference, and I show this picture because you could see there to the left of me is a person named Christina Reed. You probably might recognize Rami Ismail on the other side. But Christina, she was a producer at Disney. And so she was giving our keynote at this event because the whole theme was about inclusion. And she gave this fantastic example of her success at Disney. Now, if you don't know her background, basically in her production roles at Disney, at least when she first started out there, she won 3 Oscars. One for Big Hero 6, and one for the short called Feast, and another one for it was called, what was it called? Paper. Yeah, sorry, the name escapes me. Anyway, there were 2 shorts, two short animated shorts, and the other one was Big Hero 6, which I'm sure most people are aware of. And so she was producer on these Paper Man, that was the one. And so so she won 3 Oscars. And so you might ask, how in the world? That is a great track record to have 3 projects and have, basically reach the pinnacle of your success. And so this is what she said. So, and I, again, I'm going to read this because I think it's really important. Inclusion is the act of making everyone welcome along with their uncomfortable ideas, unorthodox strategies, and unruly manners. When you make people feel welcome and valued, they engage and give you their biggest and boldest ideas. And I love this because this was in the context of her describing the creative process that they had at the time. And what they did, she said, is like when they would have like the dailies, showing the clips that were worked on, the progress on all the projects. She said they would get everybody they could in the building into a room, into the theater, to show the latest content and ask everyone for ideas. And I mean everyone. They had the catering people, they had the security people, they had the cleaning people. It wasn't limited only to the core creative staff. It wasn't limited only, to people who, had nothing else to do with the creative side. So accountants, lawyers, all of these people were invited to come in the room. And she said they would get the most amazing ideas thrown at them when people would be watching the clips on the screen, and they would say, well, what if you had the character do this instead? And, she said they were blown away. They just things they never thought of before. And a lot of this is because it was coming from people of much more diverse backgrounds than them. And so this basically gave her this style where she said, this is the way to work. You have to open yourselves up and open the process up to the broadest level of feedback so that you are willing and able to listen and to hear what's coming from different voices, because that's really a core strength. And obviously that technique worked for her because, again, 3-time Oscar winners is not a bad track record. What is really encouraging to me on this front about this issue is that we are seeing, in terms of the game industry, that the gamers, again, it's a ubiquitous form of entertainment. So the growth that's happening out there in the world is happening everywhere, especially outside the traditional markets like North America. We could see, at least by this chart, actually the number of players has gone down slightly year over year, but you're seeing tremendous growth in the rest of the world. And a lot of this growth is happening in emerging markets where they're seeing like over double-digit growth year over year, which is amazing. And so we're seeing people focus more on this, and in order to create games and create content for people from these very diverse geographies and cultures, that requires more people on the industry side. And I think more and more companies are realizing this, and they're striving to find greater talent from different regions. And so what's also cool is that, I'm going to, a little plug for the Global Game Jam. One of the key reasons I took over the running of this organization is because it has become the world's largest game creation event. And it really emphasizes the fact that game creation has become democratized because a lot of the tools are free. You can get education through YouTube and things like that. So I have met so many people who are self-taught. And as you can see here, earlier this year in January, when we did our event, it was enormous, 118 countries, almost 1,000 sites around the world. And we had people creating, over 9,600 games in 48 hours, which is a staggering amount of games. And so my reason for bringing this up is because there is hope, because with that level of diversity across so many countries, basically it automatically is inclusive in its own right, because we're opening up the process of game creation. And so we're trying to foster talent across the world. And hopefully a lot of these people who are involved will kind of get the bug, and they'll understand that game creation is a really fun thing to do. And I'm hoping that they'll continue that as a career, because we want their voices in this industry. And so I think we are on the verge of seeing that happen, between the awareness going on between like the Me Too movement and the exposure of these issues in companies recently, and the scrutiny being placed on companies today, as well as the positive effects of seeing the ubiquity of gameplay and seeing events like Global Game Jam and others out there. There's a lot of jams out there around the world that are, basically helping people understand that this is something they can do, and it's enabling them to embrace games as a form of artistic self-expression. And that's really what we're after. So how do we improve DEI in companies? Well, there's a lot of things that we can do. And again, I said this is going to be short because it's a short slot here. Here's a few very key things you can do. You have to implement inclusion as your modus operandi, which means your company's mission is to basically try and create the best content possible. And the only way you can do that, you realize, is to have the most inclusive voices and to have the most diversity in your company, so that you can, basically have that breadth of experience and vision from all these different walks of life. And that's very important, especially in creative content. You also have to work on rooting out bias, especially unconscious bias. There's a lot of great resources out there, like Facebook and Google, for example, have posted publicly their unconscious bias training. And I highly recommend taking a look at that. Also look at your recruiting practices. The language in job descriptions is very important, because if you use terms like rock star, superstar, things like that, oftentimes that turns off people, especially women. They'll look at that and say, well, rock star, I mean, that's not me, So we have to think carefully about how we're promoting these job openings and how you find candidates. Because a lot of times I hear recruiters say, well, I can't find any qualified women. And it's like, well, you're not looking in the right places. You're going to have to dig deeper and figure out, maybe my usual process isn't working well to find those candidates, because I can tell you from firsthand knowledge, those candidates are out there. They are there. You just have to find them. And again, like I mentioned earlier, don't forget retention. You have to be thinking about how do you maintain a good internal culture so that you keep people there. And also on the creative side, with the content that you're making, rethink who your true target audience is. So it's not just about making games. For example, a lot of game developers, even in diverse emerging markets, will say, well, I'm going to make my game for the United States, or for North America, or for Western Europe. But I'm like, don't think about it like that. Just make your game the way you want to make it. You can think about the target audience should be less about the specific country and more about, unless that really is your intention, like you want to release a game in China only, that has different considerations than releasing a game in the United States, for example. But, focus on, who are your players? What kind of game players do they like? Is it an RPG player? Is it a first-person shooter player? That's more of what you want to be thinking about with target audience. Also think about your content design and distribution, like where are you going to send this game? Is it going to be compatible with certain markets? Do you want it to be compatible with every market in the world? Or do you want to basically create the game you want to make and then see how it's going to adapt or not to certain markets? And that's a decision you have to make as a creative person. And you also need some process or some individual within the creative process who's asked the challenging questions about representation and other things. So, because one of the things we often see happen is like developers, if they're creating a character, will just take a stereotype of a person of color, for example, and use that stereotype because they don't know any better, because maybe they're like a white male creator, and it doesn't mean they have malicious intent. It just means they're ignorant. They don't know. So they basically take what they know. And so, there needs to be people who are overseeing that process and can help them understand, like, is that a stereotype, or actually is that character representative of that group in a positive way? And that's a really important question to ask. So those are very quick things, I realize, and my time is up here. So I think it's time for questions and answers. So thank you very much.
Well, we're back with our live chat session with Kate Edwards, who has been gracious enough not only to join us for the question and answer session, but she's also been talking with me for the past half hour, which has been very enjoyable. And we're here to take questions from the audience, but also I've prepared a couple of questions as well. And I think I'm going to start off with the topic that we just recently discussed, but it's a pretty big one, and this is the concept of basically game ethics and the necessity for it. I often get asked how do we prepare our students for situations with game ethics? And we were just talking a little bit about if we were to teach a course about game ethics, what would it include?
Well, I think it's a great question, and again, thank you for having me. It's really great to be involved with this event, and so ethics in games, it's a big topic, and that's a reason why recently I joined a little effort that got started up called ethicalgames.org, which basically we're trying to push the industry to consider having a code of ethics of sorts, mostly not just on how it treats its employees and people who work in this industry, but also on the kinds of content we produce, on the game mechanics that we create. I know when somebody will say, for example, that some mobile games are optimized to be addictive, and you'll get a very visceral knee-jerk reaction from people who work on mobile games, some people who are like, no, that's not true. That's not what we're doing at all. And yet if you dissect the game mechanics being used, it's like, this is a very addictive cycle kind of gameplay. And for people who are prone to that kind of addictive personality or behavior, they are going to have a big problem with this. In much the same way that, nicotine helps people get hooked on smoking. And so it's kind of scary to me to hear people, when they talk about using certain game mechanics that are going to be to the advantage of the company and maximize people's, microtransactions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's really helpful that we have to be in a certain level of meta thinking around what we're doing as game creators, both in the game mechanics that we're employing and how we treat our players, and in the content that we are willing to put forward. Because certain topics, I'm not saying we should avoid topics, because games, I believe in free speech, and I believe that games are a form of artistic self-expression, just like any other creative medium. So we should have the freedom to do that. But at the same time, we should do that with our eyes wide open and thinking about the choices that we're making, because that's very important. And I think the approaching games from an ethics standpoint, half of that problem is just thinking about the ethics. Whether or not you actually do something in response to it is another question, but actually being, mindful of that while you're doing your work is really important.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I've noticed about certain games, at least in terms of the marketing, like Assassin's Creed, they really sold the game on the basis that it was a multicultural team and it was a fairly inclusive team, and they're all involved in it. Would you say that it's a pretty common model for companies to be inclusive enough that, like, opinions from the artists, for example, the animators, the developers, are actually reflected in the game's overall design?
I think to some degree. I mean, obviously it depends on the company culture, because, every company has a different kind of culture. I think the best cultures are the ones that have an inclusive mindset. Just to give you an example from film, Christina Reed, who's a friend of mine, she was the producer on the movie Big Hero 6. And so when she did three projects in a row at Disney, Big Hero 6, and then 2 shorts called Paperman and Feast, which were, animated shorts that were with Disney films. And she won Oscars for all 3 of those projects. And she described the process of creation that they used, which they specifically and intentionally designed it to be as inclusive as possible. And what they did, and I think I may have mentioned this in my talk, is that she basically said, we want to hear from absolutely everyone. We don't care what your job is. We don't care how senior or junior you are. Every person in this room has a valid opinion and a perspective, and we want to hear it. And so basically they would set that ground rule, and they just want to hear from everybody. And I think having that is like the purest form of inclusion, where it's basically, if you're human, we want your opinion. We don't care anything else about you. We don't care about your, anything, gender, ethnicity, religion, whatever, it doesn't matter. And I think having that approach really opens us up to the idea, especially when you get feedback from people. You get the idea that everybody has a voice and everyone has a valid voice. That doesn't mean you have to incorporate everything everyone suggests, but to actually open yourself up to the broadest level of input is actually really beneficial to the creative process, because you will often hear things that you never, ever thought about.
The Academy Awards have introduced guidelines for basically more inclusive film production. Is this something that you think would work in the gaming industry, or what's your perspective on that?
I think it's hard to impose. I mean, I think having guidelines or suggestions, like here's, I think we've already, I know I'm one of many who've been pushing for a more inclusive industry to see us have better representation. And the reality for that, I think, is pretty basic, because we know, we know from empirical data that those who play games today represent the broadest spectrum of humanity. All genders, all ethnicities, all cultures, all political backgrounds, all of that. So because basically games have become a ubiquitous form of entertainment, just like film, television, radio, music, all these other forms of creative media. So given that we know that those who play games are very diverse and represent all backgrounds, we also know from empirical data that those who are making games are not incredibly diverse, and not, at least in the West, it's not. When we have only like 20% women on average at companies in Western Europe and North America, that is not inclusive. Or when we look at the ethnicity numbers, it's even worse. And so if we're trying to create media that is appealing to people out there who we know already are from very diverse backgrounds, it only is to our advantage to have diverse teams, because that helps us understand what would people from these different cultures enjoy, what would be interesting to them. And having that perspective during the creative process is absolutely crucial, which is why a lot of game companies today, in the absence of having that expertise in-house, especially if they're a smaller studio, that's why they take the effort to go actually ask people from that background, especially if the game explicitly involves of that background. And we've seen a lot of good examples of that, like Assassin's Creed 3, where they had the Connor character who's a Cherokee Indian. And of course, so Ubisoft went to the Cherokee Nation and they had an advisor who directly, worked with them. Like the game Never Alone that I did a little bit of work on about the Inuit culture. I mean, that whole game was designed with the Inuit people. It was a partnership with them to create that game, because the entire game is based on their culture. And that's basically the way you have to do it. So if you have if you don't have the representation in-house, then you have to go seek it out.
I mean, that's obviously one way to approach the issue, to have consultants, to have a more diverse team. But I have a question from YouTube that those two answers I already have. Maybe you can think of a third.
Sure.
How can we encourage designers to create more diverse characters, regardless of their ethnicity?
I think that's a great question. I think the key there to me, and it's one of the questions I often ask when I'm doing my culturalization work. So if I'm working on a game and I see a set of characters presented before me, and if there's not much diversity in that set of characters, and of course there's many other variables, like is it an actual real world history? Would it make sense that there's someone of that particular background in that group for that particular time and place in history? But if it, a lot of games are not there. I mean, yeah, there's some games that are historically based. Like I'm working on Age of Empires 4, but there's many that are fantasy, sci-fi, etc. So like, especially in those contexts, if I see the characters and there's not much diversity, I will often just gently challenge, not like be aggressive, but just ask them, would it make a difference if this character is an Asian female rather than a white male? Would it really change the gameplay? Is it really going to change the narrative in a significant way? And in my experience, most of the time, the answer is no. It's not, it isn't, it's just not going to be that much of a factor. Now, the narrative designer might have a specific reason for making that character a certain race or gender or whatever. that's fine. I mean, they've got their reasons. As long as they have a good, clear reason that fits the narrative design, it fits the experience, then that's good. But I think it's often because we're all biased, we all come from a certain background, it's harder for us to push ourselves outside of that boundary. And oftentimes it's harder to do that. And so, you have to push yourself as a creator, and you also have to push each other on a team to think on that level. And again, it's kind of always this kind of meta level of thinking about, okay, I'm just going to do this because it's on my list of things to do today, is create a character for this. But then at some point, step back and say, well, let me think. Did that character need to be Caucasian? Can I make them somebody different? And is it really going to change things? And I think having that level of thought integrated with the creative process, whether it comes from you personally, which I think it should, or from team members, I think is really important.
We talked a little bit about this before we started the session, about depicting things that are based on real events. And Age of Empires was a great example. How do you go about doing that in an inclusive manner?
Well, I think with real world events, obviously you have to be very careful about what you're depicting. Some events like the game about the Iranian Revolution in 1979, I think it's a great game. If you want to feel the visceral experience of being in Tehran on the verge of revolution in 1979, it's a great game for that. At the same time, that topic in Iran is highly controversial, and the government of Iran really kind of pushed back on that game, saying, basically they don't like it. That's not a surprise. If you're going to make a game about, like, for example, a combat game about China and Taiwan, that's going to be really sensitive. Trust me, you want to be very careful about something like that. And, so the topics that you choose obviously have to be very careful. And I think you really have to think about why is the game being set in this time period? Oftentimes it comes from a desire to recreate the events in that time and place so that the player, because games are an empathy engine, it gives the player a chance to kind of walk the walk of that time period and of those people. And I think that's a fantastic thing, but you have to think carefully about what really is the intent of what we're doing? Why are we representing that period of time? And what really do we want the player to get out of this experience? And so you have to think very carefully about the time period you're using and the representation within that time period, and just kind of think those things through very openly and have a very open discussion about it, rather than, again, just sort of have this knee jerk where you're just like, I think I'll make a game about the Holocaust. Why not? Yeah. It's like, well, you may want to think about that. That's a very delicate topic.
I want to close really quick with a question about the Global Game Jam. To what extent is the Global Game Jam maybe a good medium to sort of affect change?
Well, I think one of the great powers of the Global Game Jam, and it's one of the reasons why I agreed to become its executive director last year, is because this organization is so extensive in its reach. So, I mean, the inclusivity of this organization and of this event is kind of built into what we do. I mean, last year we had almost 50,000 people in 118 countries, in almost 1,000 sites. And in one weekend, they created just over 9,600 games, wow, which is incredible. And so 118 countries, and, from places including Iran, South Sudan, a lot of emerging markets around the world. And I love it because it is encouraging people to use and explore games as a form of self-expression. And it gives them that chance to try it for the first time if they've never, because we often have first-time people who've never tried making a game before. And so it's really exciting to see people come out of the experience. And for some, they walk out of it saying, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I want to be a game creator. This is what I'm going to do. And for others, it may not be the thing that grabs them completely, but it might influence their thinking on what a game is and what a game could be. And they might kind of tinker and kind of become like a hobbyist who explores sort of the fringes of what games can be, rather than games as just pure commercialism, but games as true art. And that's really exciting to me. And so that's why, one of the reasons why I love this event, and I really encourage people to take part in it.
Okay, well, we're sort of running out of time. We're going to be starting a panel discussion. Thank you again for making time for us, and also with the question and answer session. Hopefully we have the opportunity to meet in real person at some point.
Yes.
If California doesn't burn down first.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you again.
Stay safe. Yeah, and talk to you some other time. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, we're finished. Now I have to set up. I'm sorry. The thing about Zoom is that people sort of join these rooms, and I have to.
Hello and welcome to the Expanded Animation Industry Day panel discussion, a new media manifesto live stream as part of Ars Electronica 2020. A manifesto is a public document. Unlike an artist's statement, a manifesto is a forward-looking statement of intent that sets out ambition, purpose, aspiration, and to some greater or lesser extent, an implicit prediction of the future, or at very least, an attempt to understand that future. The form of the manifesto has an important history in artistic practice, acting as a catalyst for action or as a response to underlying political and economic uncertainties of a time. A manifesto can be the product of a single author, or, as with the case of a political manifesto, the voice of a collective. The history of the manifesto often merges these two elements. Today, we are in a global economic crisis, a crisis of global political stability, a global health crisis, and a global environmental crisis. It is a time for us to ask big questions, but even more fundamentally than that, who is the us, and is there a them? Our conversation will be a distillation of and an attempt to find a collective voice in the noise. The aim is not to necessarily make predictions, but to instead propose a direction and instill a sense of urgency into the debate of the role of creative practice in our rapidly changing cultural landscape. In other words, it is a time for pause and a time for action. The term new media comes with a certain amount of baggage, but it's not our intention to allow that to weigh us down. Debates about definition are definitionally not fun debates. Broadly speaking, though, we will use the term new media as an umbrella related to the most common usage of mediated by computers, and also to signal the porous nature of genre, and come to think of that, the porous nature of newness. The discussion is part of a wider project led by the Audio Research Cluster, or ARC, based at the University for the Creative Arts in Farnham. At ARC, we aim, over the coming months, to write a 2-page manifesto with provocations, questions, and statements that will be distributed in the public domain based on our conversations, including today. We would like to expand our conversation and invite you to contribute your ideas and worries. At the end of the discussion today, we will invite you to help us expand our debate by answering some questions online. So please think about the provocative questions and ambitious ideas that you would like to see in a manifesto. There are many people to thank, in front of and behind the scenes. But in particular, I'd like to mention at this point the support of Jürgen Hegler and Birgitta Hosier for their energy, wisdom, and organisational marvel. I would also like to thank in advance our panel. The panel today comes from a cross-section of music, animation, industry, education, and curation. So without committing the heresy of paraphrase of somebody else's life and career, it is my pleasure to join you in the present and introduce them to you. Okay, are we on online? Live. So it's my pleasure to introduce in real time now the panel. Dennis DeSantis, Eduard Solaz, Stuart Hilton, and also with me, Laura Lee. I thought rather than trying to condense somebody's biography myself, I'll let that difficult task onto the hands of the panel themselves. So maybe, Eduard, would you be able to give us a little overview of your life and background, and in particular, what lens you see the world through?
Hi everyone. Yes, my name is Eduard Solaz, and I'm the founder of Eclectic. It's an art space based in London. Basically, Eclectic, it's a platform basically that's to kind of promote and experimental art and music. And my background is in theater, film, and fine art. So many things quite eclectic, actually. And that's it really. And thank you so much for having me here today.
Yeah, thank you very much. And for those who don't know or aren't close to London, Eclectic is a venue on the South Bank, but you go the other way to all the other institutions that we normally associate with the South Bank. And you find yourself where sort of real grassroots and experimental artistic practice takes place. So we'll come back. Thank you for your time. Dennis DeSantis, would you be able to do the honour of introducing yourself to us, please?
Sure.
What lens do you see the world through?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it changes over time. I think the current lens that I'm seeing the world through is some kind of contemporary music education, and with the goal of trying to help more people make music. My background is in classical composition, so I studied classical composition in the United States, and then have been working for a company called Ableton since 2007, and I now live in Berlin. And my current work with Ableton is on a team that's developing interactive websites for exploring music-making concepts. And the goal of our work is to try to lower the barriers to entry. So the work is free to use. We try to make it run on as many devices as possible, and then the goal is also to remove these other barriers, like the complexity and intimidation that comes with sort of boutique music software, like the kind that we also make at Ableton.
Yeah, thank you. And your book has very practical and pragmatic ways to get through sort of blank page syndrome or equivalence. Worth looking out. It's a PDF that's available. Stuart, perhaps you might do the same and tell us your particular lens or lenses.
Yeah. Well, my background is in animation and sort of experimental animation, I guess. But then, kind of a lifetime of career in working with commercials, animated commercials and making commercials, always balancing that with education, teaching animation all the time. But at the same time as that, having a kind of a parallel existence as a musician, drummer in various bands, but also composer on various animation films. So I'm in a sort of a halfway place between music, sound, and visuals. And I suppose that makes my lens, that is my lens really, is trying to kind of find where they meet, where they pull apart. Those two sides are I'm always trying to pull them together, and I think a lot of people are, because it's in a way it's time plus ideas plus whatever medium it is. So I'm very interested in the kind of, I suppose, the difference between sound and image, and how they come together and how they make another space. I suppose that's, but in terms of education as well, I'm just trying to make it as accessible as possible and sort of not be burdened by, sort of encourage students to have not be burdened by the sort of virtuosity problem, I guess. So yeah, is that a lens? It's several lenses, a zoomy lens, I don't know.
Yeah, it's an overlapping Venn diagram of lenses, I think.
Yeah, the distorted kind of fuzzy.
I'll give you a moment to put.
That's me.
Can you introduce yourself as well, please?
Hello, everyone. And I'm Laura. I'm representing part of Audio Research Cluster 2. And it's great to be part of Ars Electronica. Also, I'm a lecturer at the University of Creative Arts, and also I work here in Berlin as a lecturer in computer and the arts. So I sort of bleed between sort of new media practice and also audio. So it's a great panel to be a part of today, to sort of like try and sort of speak the same language. And fundamentally, I'm a sort of guitarist and composer, sort of blur in these worlds. So it's really great to sort of, for this vision to happen today. So yeah.
Great. Well, as I said in my filmed introduction, we stand at a point of change in many ways around the world. And we've all sort of been part of a global experiment on many parts of our culture. But something that's been discussed for a while, and I'll go to Dennis with this question first, is that the democratization of practice has been something that has been discussed for a while through the lowering of the barriers to entry, famously and also because of the ubiquity of certain types of technology. But that's only one aspect of a democratization of change. What other areas do you think also need to change in parallel to the technological changes for us to have a chance?
I mean, there's lots of ways this conversation could go, and I would hesitate to say that I wouldn't even try to have a right answer. I could imagine some ways of thinking that are helpful, that are maybe a little cautious. So I think the phrase that you use, this ubiquity of technology, implies, or the democratization of access also implies the idea that access is the problem to solve, and that behind the door is this sort of perfect liberating technology that's waiting for everybody if only they could get to it. And we've been burned by this before, right? Like, there's been a pretty recent history of really grandiose claims about technology, like it should be easy to find all the information you'd ever want in the world. Well, through that, we've birthed surveillance capitalism. Or it should be really easy to connect every person with every other person. So we're witnessing now like real threats to Western democracy as a result of that. So I would say a change in thinking that has to happen is, if you really want to make access to technology available to everyone, you'd better be pretty sure it's the right technology. Otherwise, you're heading into a potential sort of minefield. That's a kind of scary gloom and doom prophecy. It's just something I think about, and we're trying to think about in our own work too, to make sure that when that door is open, what's behind it is really worth entering for. I think maybe a simpler and more down-to-earth thing is that there's this common trope where people say, well, the democratization of artistic production is going to lead to a lot of low-quality work. That's going to make it harder for me to find the good stuff. And I'd like us as a culture to like evolve beyond that thinking, because that's a curation problem, not a creation problem.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think this feeling there's a certain feeling that there's a change in the water, and an excitement around that, right? But also this feeling of dread. I'd just like to mention, I'm going to pass it over to Edward to bring out this question of curation and what Eclectic sort of went through rapidly. But just for the audience, if you have any questions for the panel, please write them in the YouTube chat, and we'll bring those in later on. And then we'll also have a way for you to contribute your own ideas, optimistic, pessimistic, or otherwise, at the end, what your manifesto of change would be. Edward, Eclectic went very, very quickly and very fast from a physical space of curated experimental practice to off-site. How did as someone who has some element of a curtain through curation, how did you experience experimental art adapt to that very rapid change in March, April?
Yeah, I mean, it was quite crazy the way we kind of moved to the digital, virtual, online. It was obviously, it was kind of a moment of panicking, because all of a sudden it's like, well, you cannot organize more events. You need to, the venue has to be closed. So what are we going to do now? And for us, it was like, okay, we need to kind of do something, not only for Eclectic to be present, but also to embrace the community, because cancellations and a lot of people, without having the chance to play for who knew, And what we did basically is kind of like try to gather all the emails, all the information from different people, and basically send kind of a question that if they wanted to be part of this new experiment. And we luckily, a lot of people responded positively, and we had all of a sudden like over 80 artists willing to be part of this kind of new Eclectic offsite. And so we kind of created this kind of a draft website, and we put a lot of people together, and then we started organizing slowly learning the technology, more live streaming events. Obviously, I kind of sometimes we felt like there was this kind of two sides. The needs, obviously, for the artists, for the musicians to play, to communicate, to share all their music, but at the same time, it was like, well, this is not the same. But for us, it was more like the fact that I think it's important to at that time to feel that we are together and provide this platform and this kind of somehow protection and say, okay, we don't know where we're going to. This is so new, and then we just need to kind of make sure that we move forwards. And obviously, it was a matter of testing and then say, okay, this works, it doesn't work. And obviously, the good thing, I guess, with experimental music and arts community is, well, okay, we make mistakes, but it's always with a learning behind and say, okay, this doesn't work, let's go to the next step. So I think it's been really a really good experience for not only as a curator or as having behind an organization. It's also how you feel the needs and also the passion and this is what it's for us. It's what's kind of the most important thing.
Yeah, that there's this human element, of wanting to touch or feel something emotionally together has been, taken apart very quickly, and then also we have this ability to do some proxy of it, mediated through a screen. Stuart, as someone who has a foot strongly in, as an animator, how do you think about other people suddenly having to mediate themselves through screens, often for the first time? What experience does kind of animators who have been doing this for a long time, what experience can they bring to this change for others?
That's interesting. I mean, I think kind of what Eduard was saying about, I was wondering, actually, I was going to ask whether the artists you were commissioning or curating adapt work that they were already doing, or whether they react and make new work in this place more. Because I suppose what's happened, certainly with the students that I'm working with, is quite a few of them that were designing kind of experiential kind of pieces can't do that anymore. So now then they end up making a kind of virtual version that you would then maybe tour around. So there's obviously the VR aspect that could expand it. And also another thing that sort of occurs is just watching everyone speak is the sort of the glitchiness and the bittiness of the communication. That's what I found. I think a lot of the students have found it very difficult working as animators to try to even sharing screens, and we'll have had experiences of sharing screens that are glitchy, that stop, that we're kind of at the mercy of whatever level of connection we have individually. So there's this version, this utopian version of this kind of communication, where it all just flows and it's sort of invisible, but it just isn't. And as Dennis was saying earlier, it's just it's what the technology does have this heavy footprint on everything that we make. And this, it's whatever software that students use, they have that's got a texture, it's got a feel that comes out in the work. And it's the same with music, whatever instruments you use, whatever electronic devices or filters you might end up using, they all have a footprint or a fingerprint or whatever, some kind of evidence of it. So yeah, I've lost your question. Sorry, Harry, but I've come up on a slight ramble. But I think that's what people are certainly encountering is sort of just how to make that screen, that small rectangle, be more than it is right now. And it's interesting that a lot of students carry around small screens, and we all do. We often mediate the work through that as well. We're often showing work through that, even in physical spaces. We can say, "Oh, have a look at this test," and we're forever looking at things on small screens. So it feels like even though all the technology for 8K and whatever else is out there, there's also this kind of conflict with the smallness and the stickiness of communication in this sort of experience we're having now.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of a little comment that author John Green made, which was that the word being on your phone is not the right word. The experience is actually being in your phone. And that I think this is in lots of the talks so far have had some element about the promise of VR, but there is an isolation in being within VR as well as an immersiveness, and there can be an immersiveness within a 2-inch screen because we experience that while we're waiting for the lights to cross, and we can be fully immersed in that tiny screen. So those this idea of a new media being mediated through pixels is
it's interesting that the idea we think of the word screen and we make an image and it's a rectangle inevitably, sometimes a square. Instagram reacquainted us with the square. I guess there'll be technology in the future where you can just kind of cut out a screen off a sheet and it can be a screen. You can imagine a version of a screen that doesn't have to be formatted in the way that at the moment we have to consider. I would be interested to know if that kind of thing would make a new kind of media grow, where the screen itself is, you can wrap it around yourself, or the VR concept, where it is isolated, but So,
maybe I could draw this back to Dennis as someone who has their foot in the development of some softwares that people will express themselves through. What sort of trajectory do you think, or thinking in the broadest, most optimistic technological utopian, how do you think the technology can help and continue to sort of dissipate barriers of different types? Do you have I described your book earlier as pragmatic, but what's your sort of have you got what's the opposite of a pragmatist? An idealist, I suppose. So what's your idealistic future of how technology can aid us with these?
It's a really good question. I mean, the more you see, to frame it as like a trend that I'm seeing that might be not the idealistic outcome, you could see more and more the sort of stripping away of people's agency in their work, and often by choice. So people say, I want this system to provide the answers for me. And then you're not so far from, I want this system to make the art for me. And that's a slippery slope, I think. And I'm not necessarily even talking about an AI or machine learning based situation. There's a lot of music making in particular that's done in a kind of assemblage way, right? Where people are putting together components that are not authored by them. I mean, you can sampling culture, for example, and this is not a critique of that culture, but there is a point at which your authorship has dissipated in some way. So I guess maybe my idealistic look at the future is tools and technologies that help people do the thing they came to the tools for in the first place, not kick them out of the equation.
Yeah, and maybe just to sort of open it up, I think that part of these discussions are they sit outside a particular genre very often, and we find that the same discussion might be applicable to architecture, perhaps, and using generative machine learning to, create components in architecture or biology and all sorts of different areas. I wonder sometimes whether people have a feeling that our individual areas of interest or genre, for want of a word, are dissipating and getting further apart, or are they coming together? Are we creating a sort of new version of the natural sciences, which was a sort of very all-encompassing word? Is there something? Which direction do people feel this is happening? And if it's both, I think that would be an interesting thing to discuss, how that's possible or why. I don't know if anybody has some. I can't gaze around my screen, but if anybody's willing to jump in with an idea about that difference.
Well, maybe I would say that I guess perhaps it's too soon to predict, but obviously all these technologies are really, I think, helping many artists, creative, that perhaps, especially with the accessibility and these tools are really encouraging more people to be creative. But at the same time, the reality is that there's some limitations, in terms of the liveliness of and then how you perceive. It's obviously the phenomenology of a performance, being live, and how you perceive and feel the musician or the musicians or the performer. But I think somehow, I slowly I can feel that something is opening, a new not disciplines, but a kind of a mixture, using the internet, using softwares that allows you to be more creative and maybe in a safe space at the same time. So
that safe aspect of safety, Stuart, maybe that's something you can. How do you Stuart, as someone with a great experience as a talented educator, how do you allow that safety and that's required for experimentation? And is there a particular challenge of that now?
It is increasingly. Well, it's always been there, I think, a little, but more so now in the way that education is funded. There's a real kind of sense that students maybe investing in training or something of that nature, which fights a little bit against things like where my sort of practice comes from, which is experimentation and sort of trying to be fearless as much as possible and not worrying about the outcome, but not worrying about an audience, but caring that there is one. Not trying to read them, but understanding that there is one. And I think knowing what the audience, what the context of a piece of work is, obviously at the moment, people want work. So an animation has a long tradition of, kind of cartoonery and so on. So there's a whole dimension there that people want to get the skills. But at the same time, there's so much, like we've been discussing today, there's so much new technology that they are much closer to than someone like myself, who, I want to know all this technology, and there's too much of it in the audio realm, in the visual realm, for me to get hold of enough. But at the same time, I like the idea, and I try to encourage the idea that if you just have a few of those tools, just to start you off, you can feel your way into ideas and try to get to those ideas and not be burdened by this sort of, I've mentioned it earlier, but this virtuosity, which I love and appreciate, craft and so on, But when students start, they can't have that yet. They won't have it yet, but it can't discourage you from exploring fabulous new things that people like me may not make. You know, we can be surprised and amazed by people that make things without that virtuosity. And I think these new sort of machines can enable people to get to that. But again, it's how we navigate through the sort of the question of authorship and how much is coming out of the machine itself, you know. And people can get sort of, let's call it, impressed by a certain kind of texture or a certain kind of shine or gleam or apparent control that machines can give you. And I try to encourage going wrong. I always, you know, I kind of bang on about be strong, be wrong in a way. Just treat the machine wrongly or do it wrong, or don't read too much about the manual. See if you can find your way in and see what you find. So I think, you know, that's kind of a little mantra in a teaching context. I try to encourage that as much as possible. It's punk rock aesthetic as well. You know, in its essence, that's kind of what it is. You know, it's nothing new, but it can still work in an interesting way now because there is so many amazing, so much technology, and they actually can get in there and start writing it and making that technology themselves, which is also another interesting layer to this that feels out of touch for me. You know, I haven't got time to learn those skills, so it feels like I want to know about, you know, programming, but there is no time.
I think that's, you know, that idea, rather than approaching it in terms of a disintegration or confluence of genre or type, but really maybe a change between high art and other art, you know, that punk rock aesthetic. Maybe that's something, in the words of
the other place you were mentioning earlier about eclectic being the other place down the river.
Well, that's right, exactly. You know, turn left at Waterloo, don't turn right. Well, depending whether, that's assuming you're coming from the South Bank, from the south.
So many assumptions, Harry. So many assumptions.
Just to pass it over, Laura is I'm going to hand over to Laura, but perhaps I can do that through a segue through a question that's come up in the YouTube channel. So Fred says, perhaps no tool becomes more part of someone than the guitar, perhaps other than the pencil. But I'd be interested in Laura's take on the whole thing regarding the tools of the impact of the art. Laura, as well as an academic researcher looking at post-rock in particular, as a multidisciplinary approach. Perhaps you can talk about the tools, and I suppose this is really a question of embodiment, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's been really interesting today taking everyone's comments, because everything's been talking about the idea of some form of embodiment, and if that is to do with actually seeing performance, being the creator of the music or the animation, and then down to the actual craft or the actual instrument, or what you define as your instrument, I guess. So if that is a computer or like cells for an animator, to other things. But yeah, everything in my research, I've been challenging why, me personally, I go to big extents to expand beyond the guitar a lot of the time. So me personally, I've done this whole sort of research at the moment where I go right down to a simple acoustic guitar, then I expand out into quite mediated through effects, through Ableton, through immersive visuals up to, so I have this quite contradiction at the same time. And then it's interesting, me as a practitioner in this time of COVID as well, and how you still perform and how we still speak to audiences. So yeah, it's been a very interesting time for me personally. Yes, and I'm still in discovery if, you know, how my connection with my tool is, but it's an ongoing exploration, I guess.
I have a small question for you as well. How do you get around the sort of, again, one of those, part of the glitchiness of these sessions is the kind of, like latency of anyone playing together with people. I'm sure you found the same, Edward, with online performances. I don't know how people are getting around the latency issue and the lag and whether that kind of thing, that kind of property of the communication we have, is being used as part of the material, I guess. I wonder if people are embracing the lag and
I guess people have done that aesthetically, haven't they, with things like glitch. So I quite like the aesthetic of some glitch work. But yeah, it's interesting, like, you're talking about flow. I'm very interested in, before this happened, performance flow when you're using mediation. So it's to do with, like, so things like with Ableton, they have a thing called, quote me if I'm wrong, Dennis, on this, Beat Seeker, which is sort of trying to get, before trying to perform as a band in this time, it's about how you can perform with something mediated in real time and still feel the flow and band dynamic. And then on top of that, then you're trying to do it streaming and in these times. So I always started my research in a time where I thought people want to work in this way and flow is getting disrupted. We're not at a point where we can just inherently just work in this way, but so many people are interested and want to work this way. Then we put this on top as well. So yeah, it's become much more solo work, I guess. But I think hopefully there'll be ways around this. And I'm interested in flow of not literal practice collaboration, but maybe curation, sort of artistic, working with other people internationally, or so I'm half and half about this. I think there is issues with flow, but I think it's a good time for people to work around these restrictions, I guess. So yeah, that's my perspective on it. But I think what we were going to do towards the end of this panel is trying to actually sort of collate some of these thoughts that we've all been having. And it's been, really interesting so far to have it from all your perspectives, because I think what I was passionate about today is bringing together this idea of industry, artist perspective, and also from the cultural perspective. We're in a time where, difficult to get people to not only create new challenging work, but also go and see challenging new work, and also to feel like they have the money to start creating work, social issues and things like that. So I think I'm going to hand it, is Harry going to put on the screen of us trying to collate these comments from everyone?
The idea is there should be a link in the chat that if you click on will allow you to answer some questions. Then I'm going to share my screen and our answers can be shown in real time, but I don't know if it has come up on the chat yet because I'm trying to copy from one place to another. Can you give me a if you can see it?
I can't see it, but I should be able to, I might be able to do this myself. Because what we want to do is to start through Audio Research Cluster is sort of build a sort of, sort of primitive first sort of insight into somehow these sort of, perhaps a bit like what we were just talking about there, sort of like the greatest current artistic challenges we have and the greatest opportunities we have right now. So if people can see this link within the chat, can they see this? And also there should be, I think Harry will put this into YouTube also.
Yeah, I'll share my part.
So what we're going to do... I'm using an iPad and I'm not sure if it's going to let me do that. I'm worried that it's going to disappear. If I disappear...
Oh, okay. So if you can use this link, or if people on YouTube can use this, this will just help us build like a quick, cohesive few one-liners to try and sort of build this sort of new vision of where we are right now. So I don't know if you can share your screen now.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you go to menti.com, menti.com, and type in the code 2978568, that should be on your screen. Then it'll give you the some questions where you can type, and then the answers will come up on this screen. I think maybe it's YouTube has decided that the link is spam and not allowed it through, or link sharing has been an issue there. But if you go to menti, menti.com, then 2978568.
So yeah, what we wanted to propose to the panel and also anyone who's watching is, for this first question, is what is the greatest current artistic challenges and opportunities? And these are just captured in one word. So perhaps some people can start, and then I'm going to start picking out words, and hopefully people can start commenting on this. So if anyone wants to start, so I've got YouTube. Someone needs the link, but I think, as Harry just said, if you go to menti.com, then you should be able to use this code and start sort of inputting into your visions for sort of challenges and opportunities that we find ourselves currently. Okay, we've got some comments now. So the first few comments we've got distance, technology, and COVID. And it's interesting actually how we phrase this question. We've put it within challenges and opportunities, and whether people find technology the challenge or the opportunity. Okay, nice. Okay, so we've got some more ones. Sharing, danger, distance. So perhaps maybe we should open it out to the panel. Is there any captured one words here that are resonating with any of you?
Well, distance, of course, is one of the most interesting. In terms of an educator, I've been speaking simultaneously with people in sort of California and China, having sort of tutorial sessions and so on. So, and I think there's inevitably, in the same way that players, performers can, accepting the latency issue and so on, it's just really interesting that people could, play together across the world. And it is that sort of, that's kind of the utopian version of this, the utopian vision. Whether it ever really works, it's just been so glitchy. Interesting, obviously aesthetically, due to glitching, but distance is, clearly something that's been really highlighted, especially in the COVID situation.
There's a bit of a paradox here, though, isn't it? Which is, for the first time, it's become kind of as easy to see someone on the other side of the world as it is to see your neighbour.
Yeah.
In fact, during lockdown, you kind of knew everybody was at home and you could get hold of them. So that there's a paradox to the distance being. I mean, that's why it's a challenge, but also the opportunity aspect of it.
Was there, Dennis? Is there any quotes or comments here that resonate with you?
I'm interested in danger. I wish I knew more about where that came from, because I'd like to know whether it's a challenge or an opportunity.
Yeah, because I thought sometimes what I was interested earlier is idea of experimentation, risk taking, and danger. So whether that could be encapsulated into that. It's an interesting. What was your take on that?
I found it it felt like an inspiration. Like I don't think about danger in my own work anywhere near enough. I play things very safe, and I like this as to think of it more as an opportunity rather than.
It's interesting to think what danger actually is in terms of work, how it manifests itself. Is it, is it fear actually? Is it fear of offense? Is it fear of failure at the thing you tried? It's just an interesting open question as to what constitutes danger in terms of artistic practice.
Definitely. And I think maybe in some respects, I feel like I'm interested to know whether people obviously when we're in a room with each other, then we have to sort of take risks because we have others, our peers in front of us in the room, but perhaps people feel like they can take more risks online. I find that really interesting. What about you, Eduard? Is there any comments here?
Well, I guess the word distance and inclusion, I think, at the same time, it's like we are, with all these tools, we can get closer than, never happened before maybe, but it's also this moment of inclusion as well that is really important, that accessibility to these tools and how we use these tools to not to divide because obviously this is here, I guess, the danger as well of the new technology and how we create these technologies, and we remember that everybody has to be able to use them, and how the pattern and each element of each this software and how we create all this software, having the vision of everybody has to be able to use them. So that's kind of this dichotomy with distance and inclusion.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's actually, in this group of words, there's quite sort of emotionally driven sort of comments, isn't there? And maybe times of, I've got from we've got political isolation, extremism. So yeah, we're sort of really sort of touching upon quite emotive comments here, aren't we? Which implies that there is a change that wants to happen.
Abundance is an interesting one too, actually. Abundance is quite a positive version of sort of excess, maybe, which is quite interesting. And it's someone's warmly disposed to something there, which is nice. Because it's that idea, of I can't remember who came up with it actually, but it was film used to be. It's said that film emphasized the preciousness of time, and video emphasized the abundance of time. And I quite like that. It's kind of an old school, kind of origins of that comment, but it is interesting that we're all making more layers of time.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's interesting. The times we live in, like everyone, maybe even before, like maybe still now, I haven't got enough time. But perhaps in our isolation times, have we got more time than we need, and maybe too much excess time leads to less creativity, or does it actually enable us to do even more? What's your thoughts on this, Dennis? Do you think now we're not so busy technically because we're?
It's hard to say. I mean, different people are busy now in different ways, and I wouldn't. I mean, some of us are living more leisurely lives, and some of us are probably doubling down on responsibility as a result of that. I mean, I'm thinking about parents at home with their children now in the COVID time. So this time is not evenly meted out. In some ways.
COVID time is a good phrase, actually. Just we're living in COVID time. It feels like it's got its own kind of pace or variations. I don't know. It's something going on with COVID time.
Yeah, and I'd be really interested to see what, us looking at these comments in a year's time and how our perception of time and creativity is still felt, in these COVID times. But I think that's a really good pool of answers to one of the sort of building blocks of this manifesto. So we have the next question now, which is, what is your manifesto contribution? So if we had a blank page and we wanted to build a sort of, if we say new media, we're sort of talking to media practice. If you define yourself as an animator and music maker, programmer, engineer, composer, so perhaps whether you can use this code now. I'm just checking on, there's a few comments happening on YouTube at the same time. It can help reduce the threat on climate distance. I'll be doing a few. The opportunity is so much to have normal. Okay, cool. So I'm going to try and see if we can add into the contribution to the manifesto. So our idea from Audio Research Cluster is to sort of build sort of this artistic manifesto. And I think it's more from the perspective of a collective response to artistic mediated practice in the times we find ourselves in. So if people can start contributing to this. Okay, so the first comment, much of technology has been created for war and commerce, and then reported as art. We make technology that might one day be reported by them. Okay. Any other thoughts? Okay. This is amazing as well. In real time, I'm trying to respond to this as well, like be more open than ever before. I mean, yeah, interested to the idea of how we can be, yeah, more open. What are your thoughts on this, Harry, so far?
So it's nice just seeing these come in. I think, you know, the idea of a manifesto that was in the introduction is that it's somewhere in between a collective viewpoint and a personal one. There's, you know, it could be an extremely personal manifesto of aims and objectives, or it could be a very sort of wide and collective response. And I think the need for it, I think, comes from the fact that if we don't do something, things will happen to us. And I mean, and here the us, I think, is creative individuals. That, you know, in other words, the tide is kind of changing, but we might need to be swimming. And which direction do we swim? And just thinking about, you know, positive directions that to go in, and stating them, and maybe being provocative and brave in those statements. So, you know, a manifesto may not be something that we entirely agree with, but at least it can set a direction for us to join in or go the other way, you know, with. So I think, you know, this idea of technology being created for war and commerce, I mean, that's absolutely true. And the open source movement is maybe something that is has some kind of counterculture. They're complicated things, but I'm looking forward to seeing some more of these come in. I know it's a very difficult and big question, but yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing.
I've just seen a comment from Birgitta saying, let's do away with all borders, be international and open to difference. Yes, I'm very much in agreement to that. That would be an amazing way forward, artistically and, yeah, politically. Okay. An emphasis on longevity of software and computer tools, less reliance on inferior technology. Any comments on this new comment that's just come in?
I like that. I wish I could talk to the person who wrote it. That's an emphasis on the longevity of software and computer tools. So this is an interesting, this leads down really interesting directions. I mean, there's a sense of responsibility shared on both sides, like for the makers of the technology to make things that will last, and for the users of the technology to treat them with care in the way that you might treat a favorite guitar or something.
Yeah, I think it'd be interested on how we, is it transient with these use of these sort of softwares, and we don't sort of feel so connected to the work, or the ideas are transient and throwaway. Perhaps, we don't have this sort of connection, like you say, to like a sort of acoustic instrument or so forth.
There's always that feeling that there's some more coming. There's some more technology waiting around the corner to just surprise you or something. And it is interesting that, again, they all have their, their sort of their mark to make. If you think of, I don't know, scratch video, that sort of movement lasted a really short time. It's just, but it's aesthetically has driven quite a lot of work, even after that period of scratch video, that sort of that look, that texture, and people get drawn to, artists get drawn to it, and it becomes commodified, obviously, in videos or to sell bands and so on. So it's an interesting idea, the idea of longevity, but also feels a little bit kind of utopian, as it inevitably it will just dissipate, and another one will come along, and it does feel. I like the idea that it has longevity, and we're forever just filling, landfill with old machines and so on. But then there is also people. There are people going back to those old machines and trying to just reanimate them.
I definitely think that. So I think we're coming to the end of our session for the panel, and for us at Audio Research Cluster really want to thank the panelists today and your thoughts and your contribution to our sort of research and our thinking around this topic. Is there any quick final 1 or 2 sentences from each panelist?
I'm going to jump in because I just think this whole experience is really brilliant. This is where these kinds of conversations and all the conversations going around for the whole expanded animation conference is it's just so exciting. And I've seen so much really interesting work for myself. I'm educating myself all the time. Trying to find time to be educated is quite difficult in COVID time. But I've just found it really inspirational, actually. And these conversations just, in a way, they find where the underground, whatever that is, they find it and we're pulling it out and make it go overground.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. That's a really good point. And yeah, thanks for your comments today. Eduard, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I love technology and eclectic. Is always trying to be involved with researchers and people that have kind of pioneers in new ways of creating. But I would say it's important that the technology obviously exists, but we keep remembering what's the importance of culture, because I think somehow culture is collapsing, and in so many countries since COVID, culture has been put aside, and then obviously we is completely unbalanced. So how we move forward, with all this craziness.
Yeah, definitely. Almost like this new digital culture, or I think that's a really nice final comment. And yeah, thank you for your contribution to the panel today. Dennis, any last words or comments about today's session?
I mean, I think it's great to get people together to talk about this sort of thing. I think it's exciting to think about other creative practitioners having these kinds of conversations, hopefully sometime soon in the real world, but for now, even this way. I mean, I think an important thing to think about when you're trying to develop a creative practice that's mediated by technology is to not lose yourself in the apparent abundance and the apparent complexity, and then forget the sort of initial, somewhat primal impulse that got you to try to do the thing you wanted to do in the first place.
Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, thank you, Dennis, for your contributions today. And we're going to hand over now in sort of half an hour's time. I think that's correct, Jürgen. We're going to have the pre-forum and the sort of electronic theatre screening happening. And but yes, thank you to all panelists. Thank you for contributing to the Audio Research Cluster. This makes me all very happy. And yeah, thank you for all of your time.
Thank you so much.
Fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Do we leave?